Okay, welcome. I'm Steve. I'm the owner of Aquarium Zen. Most of you are familiar faces. Thank you for being here today, supporting the store. We've been here for 10 years now, presenting the nature aquarium concept, which is the original term for what most people call aquascaping nowadays. It was started by Takashi Amano, an artist from Japan who, since childhood was fascinated with freshwater environments and started incorporating more like artistic design from the Japanese garden tradition into the aquarium. So that was kind of revolutionary because before he came along, the aquarium was more of a cage for fish and not so much an art form. So I always like to bring up Takashi Amano in my lectures, and someone I hope you'll investigate and do research on your own. Today I thought the theme would be process, and just kind of like orient the talk around that. It's a pretty spontaneous process, these talks, so but your questions are always welcomed. You're welcome just like pop up a question and I'll try to field it and incorporate it into what I'm going to be talking about today. So this tank here is our model, our teacher, so to speak. This one's been going for about 8 months, and what we see here is about 65 gallons. It's what we might consider a high-tech aquarium. It has very bright lighting. It has a nutrient-based soil, a clay-based soil, carbon dioxide, and frequent fertilizer. So that's often what people refer to when they say high tech. It basically has all the bells and whistles that you could give an aquarium to optimize plant growth and to create one of these aquascapes or nature aquariums, as I like to call them. So here, I'll just kind of feel some ideas. What do you guys see? Just if anyone wants to pop up an idea or thought or impression.
I really like the hardscape.
You like the hardscape? What do you like about the hardscape? Just so curious.
I like that it creates a natural layering in the aquarium so that it leads the eye back into the space. And it also makes it look bigger than it is, because I know it's a 65, but it looks a lot larger. It creates a lot of depth.
Cool. Nice. Yeah, so the hardscape we see here, so when part of my process is I was really inspired by this plant. I wanted to work with this plant. I also wanted to work with this fish. So when I designed the hardscape, I knew I was going to create a very lush planting to incorporate this plant into sort of a field of more of a garden look. And I knew I wanted that red fish. So by arranging the hardscape the way I did, I created a zone of permanent negative space in this aquarium, because as the plants fill in, they're going to create such density that the fish could kind of get lost, honestly, in a jungle of dense plantings. So by arranging the rocks here, there's this open water zone for them to swim in that they'll always be in, no matter what. So I've kind of directed the placement of the fish in a way by the placement of the hardscape. So that was very intentional, and that was part of my design process, was to figure out, okay, I know I want to work with this plant, I know I want to work with this fish, and how will I do that to the best of my abilities. So that was very intentional. It's a simple hardscape. We just have 5 rocks. In a way, it's you probably have heard of the Iwagumi style, which is, kind of a stylized Japanese Zen garden in an aquarium. And so basically what I did is took a Iwagumi style layout. There are 5 rocks. It's a 5-stone Iwagumi, and just went wild with the plantings around it. Most Iwagumis, you have a very short growth of like carpeting plants, maybe some background plants or feature plants to accentuate the rock layout. Here I was content with basically burying the rocks in plant growth and just providing that open area for the fish to swim. So the fish are always, those red fish are pretty much always sitting there, creating a focal point, which is about a third the way over from the layout. So pretty intentional in the design, and I knew that was going to happen.
I like the shrimp. Is that an Amano shrimp?
You like the shrimp? Yeah, that is a mono shrimp. So Takashi Amano, when he grew up in Japan, he spent a lot of time as a kid snorkeling and playing in a freshwater marsh near his house. And that's where he got a lot of his observations on how plants and fish and invertebrates grow. And these shrimps, fortunately or unfortunately, kind of got named after him, but they're very common in those environments. And he noticed the shrimps were grooming the plants and feeding on algae and biofilm on the plants. And up until that time, I don't think people had really thought about using shrimps, for a utilitarian purpose like that. So that's pretty interesting. But yeah, there are some Amano shrimp in there. There aren't a lot of Amano shrimp in there, and that was also part of my intention, part of my design process, in that I wanted the little red cherry tetras to breed in the tank. And I started with about 20 of them. I find like 1 or 2 babies every week. If I had a lot of shrimp in this tank, the shrimps would discover, they can smell the eggs. They would discover the eggs, eat them up, and I wouldn't get any baby shrimp. So there's very few Amano shrimp in this tank, actually, just a few. I would like to have more because they're very functional. They kind of take care of a lot of the surface algae, really fine biofilms, and I do have a little bit of problem with some of the leaves, and I just kind of have to live with that because part of my design process, part of my intention in the beginning was to breed the red cherry tetra. So I just have a few shrimp in there, there definitely could be more in here. So, this tank has been going, like I said, for about 8 months. It's we're standing in front of a tank right now. You guys may not visit for another week or month or year. I live with this tank. I see it every day, and I'm seeing it changing, daily, hourly. So that's how I look at these things, as some sort of evolutionary process, natural process in a glass box. They're not static entities. A lot of us get into aquariums because we see beautiful photos on the internet or in books, and we want to emulate those designs and without really understanding that it is constantly changing. Just like nature itself, it's constantly changing.
Still having to pick the plants and the placement of.
Yeah, so I really like to engage with that process of change. The plants were selected to create this lush garden growth. I really wanted to use a lot of stem plants, a lot of fast-growing stem plants, and I wanted to layer them in the design with color and texture. These lights really accentuate bright greens and bright like pinks and reds, and I wanted to make sure I highlighted the attributes of that light as well. Like dark leaf plants, slow growing plants wouldn't work with that lighting. They would just collect algae and wouldn't look very interesting. So I was looking for light greens, I was looking for pinks. Also, just like in any process, there was just synchronicity. Things happened. People brought me plants that were of interest, like this yellow plant here, the golden Nicia, one of my customers brought me. Also, the one I kind of fell in love with, this pink macrandra green, or variegated macrandra, someone brought me. So that, it was just kind of fun. Plants just show up on my doorstep, and I got excited by them and started to work with them. So it's very, for me, it's a very spontaneous thing. It starts out with certain intentions, but then the aquarium kind of takes its own destiny. Like, you don't really have as much control over it as you might think. And I like engaging with that dynamic energy. I've seen, I've helped thousands of people. I get like about 10,000 customers a year, thousands of people over the years. And I do see a lot of people have a very set idea in mind how they want their aquarium to look, and they get frustrated when they don't achieve that. And I've never done that. It's just like I'll have an idea, and then it just kind of rolls on its own trajectory, and I just it's almost a dance. You're working with wherever this aquarium wants to go, whatever is working. Some things don't work. There were plants in here that no longer, I'm not super satisfied with the ground cover, for example. There was a Rotala mexicana goyas in there as a ground cover, which has a little bit of pink to it, and that one never really took off. So a lot of my initial design ideas never really took off, and instead I just kind of worked with what did work. And I find that's a really successful approach with aquariums, maybe even life, where you just kind of work with what's working and go in that direction and suddenly change course and move in that direction. Because it is, there's a lot of factors that create success in an aquarium, and you're not always in control of them. So the things that are working are the things maybe you want to focus on, rather than what's like working for me, what you see, oh, this is a pretty tank, I want to, copy that, and maybe it's hard to do because you don't have these lights or something, but something else is working and you can focus on that. So that's why when customers come in, they ask for advice here, I always ask them to bring a photo of their aquarium, because that really helps me direct them. I can see what's working in the aquarium. They don't often understand that. Like, why do you need a photo of my tank? And that's just really instructive for me in giving advice. Like pictures worth 1,000 words, and I find that to be true.
I like that your Tetras kind of come in like shades of orange and then shades of deep red.
Yeah, what's happening there, this is the red cherry tetra from Brazil. This is a newly described species. I think it's not been described, or it's not undescribed species. So it's not, science doesn't even know about this fish. It's been in the aquarium trade for about 4 years or so, from what I understand. We've had it here at least that long, which is pretty amazing that there's still discoveries like that being made. It shows you how vast the Amazon is, how much there's left to discover, because that's like the reddest fish on the planet, and it went undetected until about 4 years ago. So that's really interesting. But you see some have more of a shades of orange, and they have like orange body and red fins. Those are the males. The females are the very deep red ones. The ones that almost seem to be glowing red from within are females.
We like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just not common in
And
fish.
I didn't quite understand that, but in the mornings they breed, and what happens is that color contrast between the orange and the red fins gets really accentuated in the males. And so I was observing them breed. It's like, oh, okay, all the orange ones. At first I thought I might have had 2 species of fish, because there's another tetra that looks like that as well, with the orange and red fins. And it turns out the males, especially the dominant ones, are the ones with the orange and red. So yeah, the fish were, really important part of the design process. I find with me, there'll be something that stimulates me, something that inspires me, that I want to design an aquarium around. So in this case, it was the red fish. It was a lot of pink and bright green plants. Those were 2 important design elements right from the get-go that I wanted to work with. And I knew I didn't want to clutter the tank with too much hardscape. I wanted to leave a lot of room for growing plants. I like to work with plants. The kind of the modern trend in the aquascaping world is these sort of diorama kind of style, hardscape driven designs, and they're very hard to manage. That's something they don't really tell you about on Instagram or whatever, but they're kind of hard to manage. Plants are easier in my experience, and also I like to grow plants. It's just rewarding for me not to see like a static diorama that just kind of sits there. These plants change from day to day. I mean, some of them can grow an inch a day easy. And I like the process of trimming the plants and shaping it, adding, kind of layering the colors, the textures. That's all happening through selective trimming, through intentional sort of, gardening on my part. And that happens like once a week or once every other week. So if it weren't for that, this would just look like a monolithic mass of, it'd just be a jungle. So that's really an important part of the process, is the management. That's something that people often, I do some installations here and there, and people who hire me to install aquariums often don't understand aquariums. That's why they're hiring me. And it's really the maintenance that makes the beauty of the aquarium. It's like a garden. It's the human energy that goes into it that makes it beautiful. You could set it up and it looks great on day one, but how's it going to look over months, weeks, years? That all comes down to the human that's managing it. And that's what people are really responding to. If you saw this aquarium, how it looked last Wednesday, it was totally different. There was algae on the glass. There was a lot more plant growth that made it look more dense and heavy and less interesting. The water was a little dingier. You know, I corrected all those problems. You know, so it's really my energy that's shining through this beautiful environment, and that's something I don't think people talk about enough.
How do you balance the needs of the stock, the fish, with your vision for the tank? I know you said that you kind of just go with the flow, but like for example, the fish that's only been in the trade for like 4 years, they're breeding, so they're obviously happy, but I assume we don't know much about them. Like you didn't know that the males had a different coloring than the females until you observed it.
Yeah.
And I find with a lot of species of fish or invertebrate, you have to like Google it, and a lot of the information is really out of date or inaccurate, and then you just kind of have to figure it out on your own, which is difficult when you're trying to design an environment for them to thrive.
Yeah, starting out is challenging with aquariums because there's a million things you have to know. I've been doing this since I was 2. I got my first aquarium job when I was 14. I'm 53. It's you know, nearly a half a century of working with aquariums, so there's a lot to learn. You know, that's the beauty of having a local store like this or other stores. You have a resource where you can talk to people who have more experience than you, and they can direct you down a path. But it's always good to simplify it. Just having one goal to start out with, like growing a lot of plants and breeding cherry tetras, that could be enough to send you down a rabbit hole, get you started on figuring out what the needs are of the aquarium, rather than trying to incorporate, you know, a dozen different ideas. Maybe just having 1 or 2. Maybe it's just the hardscape that you like. That's inspired me to do designs, certainly, where it's like, oh, I have a beautiful piece of wood, I want to create an environment around that. That's enough. So you know, I really admire those kind of simplistic aquariums that just have like beautiful piece of wood, maybe a little moss at the base, a couple little rasboras swimming around, you know, things like that. It doesn't have to be overly complicated. So yeah, just kind of really doing some soul searching before you start an aquarium, figuring out what your like primary goal is really helpful. I find I like to live with just the blank canvas, just an empty fish tank for quite a while before I'll start. You know, this tank I tore down, I think it was the end of 2023, and then it just sat here with like a big piece of wood and some rocks for a few months. And I just kind of stared at it for a while before I really got started. Because it's a big investment, bless you, of your time and resources and money. And you just kind of want to make sure you're on a path that's satisfying rather than change horses, you know, midstream or whatever. So, yeah. You know, that, for me, that's been a successful way. Just finding what's the most inspiring thing to you to do with an aquarium in that moment, and just go down that rabbit hole, figure it out, you know.
Why do the fish stay around the hardscape?
This is open water. They can swim. All the dense plants, they kind of hide. They don't quite feel secure. They definitely go in there to breed. They go in there when they get beat up. You know, the males get beat up, and they go in there to relax. So it's like you're creating areas of refuge, and you're creating like a social stage where they can gather and hang out, and they can figure out their pecking order. They can court. They can fight. You know, they're just like us in a lot of ways. They're social animals, especially tetras. They're highly social, so they're going to want to hang out together. So having that open space gives them that stage where they can see each other, they can gather. You know, it's like a community gathering spot. The little baby tetras, you know, I don't see them till they're quite advanced. If you look around, like there's a little one that's probably, you know, been out for a few weeks. I don't see them when they're really small. They appear when they're about 1/4 inch, and then they rejoin the whole group. So they hide deep in the weeds here. We never see them, and then suddenly they're out and about. It's like, wow, you know, they're already quite advanced when we finally detect them.
What kind
So,
of angelfish do you have?
so the angelfish are a variety of red koi angelfish. So in nature, angelfish and tetras coexist. They're Amazonian species. So even though these two species may not exist in this form, like this is a man-made form of angelfish, and that is a natural form of tetra. It hasn't been artificially selected or anything. They kind of read each other's body language, you know, which I find is very useful. When you're combining fish, a really great rule of thumb is to do a little research on where they come from. And it doesn't have to be the exact spot on the earth, you know, but a general region, Southeast Asia, Thailand, the Amazon, the Congo, and select fish from those regions because they've co-evolved for millions of years. Tetras are very ancient fish. I think they're as old as like salmon or something. They're really ancient, you know, millions of years of, maybe hundreds of millions of years. I'm not sure. But a lot of these things have been evolving together in that soup of that evolutionary process for millions of years. So they kind of almost are part of each other, and they can relate to each other. When you mix fish from like New Guinea or West Africa or something, it might not be as successful. They just can't understand each other. You might have more problems with aggression and that kind of thing. So often people select their fish, what they find cute, what they find charming, not doing enough research into like where they come from, if they really coexist in nature. So you know, it's easy to stock an aquarium very quickly. You can't have that many fish really. So for me, I'd rather be more of a peaceful mix, something that has a very cohesive energy than like a menagerie of a bunch of different things. But when people start out, they often want a little bit of they just want to try everything out, and I understand that. I did the same thing when I was younger for many years. So, but that is if you just want a rule of thumb when it comes to mixing fish that could be successful, just kind of look into where they come from in nature and combine those types. It doesn't have to be the exact same type, you know. Basically, we have a cichlid from the Amazon, a tetra from the Amazon. That's enough familiarity that they can coexist peacefully together.
Not man-made species like the blood-carrot cichlids.
Well, they're still functionally, yeah, I mean, but they're still like a neotropical cichlid. So their behavior's essentially, you know, a stereotype of that type of fish. You know, they're not wildly different, you know, so I don't think it should be a problem.
Steve,
yes?
you said this is a high-tech tank.
Yes.
So for somebody who's not quite ready for
Yes.
a high-tech tank, what
Yeah.
advice do you have to create something beautiful but
Yeah.
not be high-tech?
Yeah. I mean, this is a big investment. These are $1,000 each, these lights. Those arms, just the arms to hang the lights are like $250 or something. This tank is $1,000. That's a lot of money in one fish tank. I had to start a store to fund my hobby.
You got any tips for that?
Yeah. No. And so that's a bit much to start out with, although I do see people who do that, and that's great. But it's not really required. The beauty of the kind of modern trend in aquariums is kind of starting smaller, and I think you can, you know, scaling everything down is a fun challenge and could be really rewarding. So like right here, this little guy, we see a gallon of water, 2 plants, a shrimp, and a little fish. And that's really fun. And it's operating on the same principles as this one, in that this is a plant-based ecosystem. This whole process, the health of this environment is running just much like we would see in nature, where plants are running the show. And it's the same thing here. We don't even have a filter in this tank. These fast-growing plants on the top are sequestering all the nitrogen, all the waste that's dissolved in the water that that little fish and shrimp are producing. And they're gathering light. They're gathering carbon dioxide from the air. They're floating plants, so we don't need to worry about injecting carbon dioxide like we have to do here. So, something like that can be a really rewarding way to start.
Are there certain plants that we have to choose for a low tech?
It's always good to have some kind of fast-growing plant. Floating plants in a low-tech tank could be your ideal solution because they're not carbon dioxide limited. Often when we say low-tech, that means we're not using carbon dioxide. It's good to talk about carbon dioxide. Photosynthesis is an essential, how do you call it? I mean, so important thing. Process in nature. It's how life is supported on Earth. If it wasn't for photosynthesis, none of us would be here. There would be no life on Earth. It was photosynthetic organisms when they first sprung up on the Earth that changed the atmosphere to more of an oxygen-rich atmosphere and made life habitable for to create the evolutionary process. So it's water, carbon dioxide in the presence of light that creates sugars, carbohydrates, and off gases oxygen. And it's that process that makes life possible. And just like the Earth is really driven by not necessarily terrestrial plants, but like marine algae primarily, but also terrestrial plants are very important. So they're creating the whole atmosphere that makes life livable for us and everything else. And that's really what we're recreating here on Earth. So it's one of those seeds I like to plant with you. A lot of people are resistant to getting carbon dioxide in their aquariums, but I really highly recommend it. If you can, put it in your budget, think about it at some point, because you will just start to really take off with the beauty and fun of this hobby. Because often you'll struggle with the aquarium plants when they're not given CO2, and it limits you to what you can do, and you'll often just not be as excited about it because you're battling algae. Algae often does really well in those kind of environments that are deprived of CO2 or other essential nutrients, and it may not be as rewarding. You certainly can do it. There are plenty of tanks around here that don't have CO2 and they're pretty fun, but the ones that really vibrate energy, vitality, are the ones that are CO2 enriched. And going back to Takashi Amano and the other aquascapers, all those beautiful tanks you see are always CO2 enriched. So it's just something to think about.
How do you balance that? Because I heard that sometimes the CO2 can affect some of the fish.
If it's too high.
Yeah, if it's too high, CO2, is going to asphyxiate the fish. And you could tell right away because they come to the surface and start gasping for oxygen at the surface. At that point, you'd want to turn off your CO2, do a big water change, and that should reset the system, and then you could start over. But there are ways to monitor. There's no direct measure of CO2. You have to kind of approach it from different angles, one thing is you can monitor the pH. When your CO2 starts to when it ends, it typically will drop one value. Like say if it started at 7, it should be at 6 by the end of the CO2 run. You don't want that to happen in 5 minutes. You want that to happen slowly, and that's why we have things like bubble counters, which allow us to regulate how much CO2 is being incorporated into the aquarium, and we often will start with 1 to 2 bubbles per second and then gradually build up. So bubble counters are a great way to monitor the CO2 injection. Over time you might just, like I do, I just monitor the plants. This tank actually doesn't have that much CO2 running in it. A lot of these plants just grow really well under the bright lights and the fertilizer I feed them. If you don't have CO2 right away, you can kind of help your plants with good lighting. That's probably the most important thing where I would put my money initially when buying equipment for aquarium is a good light. And then from there, a soil-based substrate is really important for the plants. And fertilizer, you could start with those things because a good CO2 system is going to be $200 to $400, so you can at least start there, and you can get creative with all that too.
I have a
How to keep algae running away? Yeah, so algae, in my experience, thrives on chaotic conditions. Aquariums are more of a mystery than something we control, is the way I look at it. So wherever we can institute some kind of control, the less chaos we're kind of bringing into the whole situation. So for example, what I mean by that, all the lights in this whole space are on just for 8 hours and on a timer. So it's a real rigid schedule. They get weekly water changes of 50%, real rigid schedule without fail. So those are some control measures that we can bring into the situation that kind of, it sounds silly, but like just keeping your lights on an 8-hour cycle on a timer, doing weekly water changes will knock out 90% of algae problems, in my opinion. Also, you have to learn how to balance things, and that's kind of hard to just, teach you. It's something you have to learn with experience. Very bright light, you have to think about like inputs, for example. This is a very bright light, so in order to minimize algae growth, we need to balance that energy input with fast plant growth. So it's kind of a game. We're trying to outcompete the algae. The algae will thrive on chaos, it'll thrive on excess nutrients, excess energy, excess light, and so we have to somehow outwit it in a way. And plant growth is my favorite way of doing it. That's why you see a lot of plants in my aquariums, because the plants are outcompeting the algae in a lot of cases. And I'm trying to control things where I can. So, that's been my strategy. If I'm having an algae problem, I will reach for more plants. And I may often throw some floating plants in there just temporarily. When I first started this design, I was having a lot of algae problems. I made some mistakes with the substrate. I let it dry out, got kind of powdery, and it was triggering algae blooms. You need to keep these clay-based, soil-based substrates moist. They can dry out very quickly. They'll degrade very quickly, and that could trigger algae problems. So I was having algae problems, so I threw in some water Sprite in here, and I grew this big mass of water Sprite in this tank. Some of you may have seen that. And that was my initial go-to for controlling the algae problem I was experiencing. I have algae problems in here, though you may not really detect them, but there are algae, like fine algae growing on the leaves of the plants. And I with my dosing schedule, I'm like constantly fiddling with it. So it's kind of you get a readout from the algae's giving you a readout, like how well are you balancing the aquarium. And there's multiple inputs that are coming in, and you have to figure out which one is out of balance. And that's something you just learn with experience. But I would say, in general, if you just want one go-to strategy for controlling algae, just add more plants. Floaters are great because if you don't have a CO2 system, they're gathering their CO2 from the air because their leaves are on the surface of the water. So they're accessing the carbon dioxide from the air. Whereas these guys, we need to saturate the water with CO2. CO2 is just rare in nature in water, and especially in an aquarium. It's not going to exist in a reasonable concentration. The fish are respiring it, but that's not enough for the plants. So there's no easy answer when it comes to algae control. If there was, people like to sell you easy answers. I see that a lot, but it's not true.
Are the floaters temporary? Because they said they can.
Yeah, they can be temporary. Yeah, that's a good point. You may just use them as a Band-Aid, and then once they've kind of grown in, you'll remove most of them or something. So you have to manage the floaters too, because they can grow in excess and kind of change things. Yes?
What's your favorite substrate to use? I've noticed some people mix it with sand or just use a specific brand. What do you like to use to promote growth and not algae?
Yeah, I like the original clay-based. Well, it depends. I will say, so for this kind of look where I have wall-to-wall plants, just like a big lush garden of plants, I will use a clay-based substrate. My favorite one is the Amazonia Aqua Soil by Aqua Design Amano. It's kind of the original. but I've used contour soil as well with good results. So we sell both those products here because those are probably the two most popular ones. But the Amazonia has been refined over the last 30 years, and it's quite good. That's my favorite. So that's what I use. They're very rich substrates, which is beneficial for plant growth, but they can, especially if you're not using carbon dioxide, it can be a lot of nutrients that you're not really assimilating with rapid plant growth. They're designed for rapid plant growth. A lot of the soil's got a bad reputation as creating ammonia spikes, and people didn't really understand that, especially outside of Japan, because that's intentional. We want to give the plants that boost of ammonia for them to grow, and but the idea is there'd be a lot of ammonia in the system. The plants would be growing fast because they're getting bright light and carbon dioxide. So you take away the bright light, you take away the carbon dioxide, you have a tank that's super saturated in ammonia, and the plants are barely using it. And that's where the problems arise and where the soil's got a bad reputation. But it's actually a benefit to, and so ADA changed their formula where you actually add, so the soil itself is quite neutral. It doesn't have much ammonia in it anymore. It's like basically a rice paddy clay that's been sun-baked into little balls and impregnated with urea, with ammonia. And so I think they basically removed the ammonia, and now they have slow release little pellets that you put into the substrate when you first set up the tank. And so you could vary the fertility of the soil that way. So anyways, I like the ADA soil. Yeah. Any other questions?
Kind of a segue off that. So when it comes to fertilizers, then there's a lot of different products on the market with different chemical compositions, and I guess how do you navigate kind of identifying those sort of nutrient needs for the plants and balancing biomass versus those inputs and scheduling that? Scheduling
fertilizer?
Yeah.
Fertilizing for me is more of an art than a science, I find. I call it the trifecta or triple threat: the good lighting, a clay-based soil substrate, and carbon dioxide. You could grow a lot of the plants. All the plants that Takashi Amano was using in the early days in his beautiful aquascapes that inspire me can grow that way basically, and I don't even have to worry about adding fertilizer. However, plants like this pink macrandra won't grow without daily applications of fertilizer. It's a highly compromised form of a natural plant. It's just it's probably something that wouldn't exist in nature. It's just kind of a sport that we can cultivate with a lot of inputs, just for its beauty. So in that case, we're going to have to come up with a fertilizer strategy. So there are different approaches. One is the estimative index, where you're kind of super saturating the system in the beginning of the week with fertilizer, and then you do a big water change at the end. And then there's I think it's called PPT or something, where you're doing daily doses, and that's what I'm doing here, is just a little micro dose of fertilizer for the whole system, and that's kind of been my approach for this. But I wish I could tell you just the perfect strategy for fertilizer, because every tank's different, and the fertilizer I'm using doesn't have a lot of nitrogen, and that's intended, but it has a lot of phosphates, and that helps support the plant growth, but also brings out the colors in the plants. When you have a lot of nitrogen, you're going to get bigger leaves, greener leaves, not as much color, and that I was really seeking color in this tank. So a nitrogen limited fertilizer is important in that case. So every tank's going to be different. Tanks where the plants are growing slowly, you might benefit from fertilizing potassium and not worrying so much about nitrogen or something. Things, because maybe your fish are providing enough of the so you might reach for the nutrients that are not going to exist, in fish food or something. So every tank's going to be different, and that's part of the challenge with coming up. There are companies that say, hey, this is the perfect fertilizer, all-in-one kind of thing, and it's, in my experience, it's, you know, kind of snake oil. So you really have to like kind of play around with it, play around with different brands. I like the ADA product is nice. I've never had real algae problems with the ADA product. They have different bottles and you pump in a little bit every day and it works out. It's kind of a weaker fertilizer and that's intentional so you don't overdose the system and get algae blooms. So my customers who use that seem to have good results.
How do you go about, I guess, identifying those key nutrients that might be deficient? Like you mentioned potassium there.
Yeah,
phosphate.
yeah. I mean, there are certain signs in the way the plants are growing that might indicate it, and I'm not the best at that, to be honest. You know, there are certainly people out there. Tom Barr is one of my favorite guys, plant gurus, as well as guy, I can't remember his last name, Dennis, the 2-hour aquarist is his website. He's really good at, you know, those kinds of identifications. I would check out those two. They're like really fertilizer gurus. For me, like I said, I like this trifecta of good lighting, soil, and CO2. If I could grow a plant that way, then I'm happy. Then I don't have to worry about like fertilizing every day or whatever, or worrying about, you know, the proper, you know, blend of fertilizer and that kind of thing. And that's how I operate most of these tanks. Honestly, they're not really getting much in the way of fertilizer, with the exception of this one. And this was our teacher tank today. So this one is getting daily dosing of fertilizer. And it's been a challenge because sometimes I will slightly overdose it and I'll get a big algae bloom. So it's not always that straightforward, even for me. How are we doing for time?
It is 11:56.
Okay, cool. I could probably take another question or two. Yes.
For fertilizing, is there a certain time of day you do it, like before lights?
Yeah, I'll do it in the beginning, you know, of the day, in the morning kind of thing. Much like you would feed your fish or something, you'd feed your plants. And then it's important to do consistent water changes, you know, on a at least weekly basis. A tank like this probably would benefit from more frequent water changes. A lot of the beautiful tanks you see are getting, some of them are getting daily water changes. So that's something to think about too. Yeah.
How do you balance the water change with putting the chemicals in?
What's
Doesn't it take away?
Oh yeah, I would probably do the water change, you know, like say at the end of the week, you know, maybe in the evening or something.
How long do you run your CO2?
The CO2 is running with the lights. So some people will have the CO2 turn on an hour before and an hour before the lights come on and an hour before they go off, and that's fine. That kind of makes sense to me, but I just put them on the same timer. It's more efficient for me to put them on the same timer. And you know, for me, I don't want to really struggle with an aquarium. I want it to be a joyful process, and I do see a lot of people struggling with aquariums. So simplifying things as much as you can is really helpful. So for me, like I said, that trifecta of good lighting, soil, CO2, if a plant will grow like that, then, you know, maybe that's enough and I don't have to struggle. I don't have to worry about the perfect fertilizer blend or whatever. And, you know, if a plant is too hard to keep, like I may ditch this plant eventually because it's just been so... I turned off the lights for 24 hours to knock back algae. That's one strategy I'll do with algae controls. Turn off the lights for a day. And the plant almost completely melted, this pink plant that I've been talking about, just in 24 hours. So it's just a really sensitive plant. Everything else is totally fine, like untouched. But that one yellowed out except for the growing edge. It's fascinating. So in that case, maybe I just want to keep struggling, keeping that thing alive, you know, and just revert to a more simpler approach.
But it's so pretty.
It's so pretty, yeah.
Like I hear you, but also...
Yeah, but it's also fun to take on a challenge too. So it's kind of up to you what your personality is like, where you are with your aquarium journey. If you just want to go on cruise control, you just want something pretty in your living room that you don't have to worry about, maybe fussing over a plant like that's not worth it. But if you like to dive in deep, you know, spend a lot of time with your aquarium doing research, and then maybe it's worthwhile figuring those things out. So there's a balance. There's a benefit, you know, like yeah, taking on a challenge and also just going with the easiest, going with the flow kind of thing.
So you have the DIY CO2 kits. Is that something that...
I think people will often start out that way because they're cheap and accessible, and then you'll realize, okay, I like the benefits of CO2, but now I want a real system. That's how I started. So I offer those because they're cheap, and they'll give people an entry point who might not otherwise have one. And then maybe they'll realize, oh yeah, I do want to do CO2, or maybe I'm done with this planted aquarium, putting my tank on Craigslist, I'm over it. You know, you kind of have to go through that rite of passage to figure out if you're going to be in it long term. And so it's not my favorite approach, but I do have to offer it. Otherwise, some people wouldn't even have the joy of using CO2. So it's a good way to get started, but I find eventually you'll want to get an actual system with the regulator, a pressurized cylinder of gas, because those you just kind of set and forget, and they work quite well.
They do.
Yeah, yeah, they work. They're amazing. So, yeah. Well, thank you all for coming, and I really appreciate it. Sorry it was tardy today, but we're on Zen time, and
Relax time.
I hope that was worthwhile for you. Thank you.